League start is an exciting time. You're leveling up, trying a new build, trying the same build that you've played for the last 5 league starts because you like playing the same thing. Or you're like me and you have no idea what you're going to be playing. But a build isn't just about picking a skill, grabbing some passives, and being good to go. Items are a very important part of character building in Path of Exile. And so today I want to talk about 10 league start items, which you should keep an eye out for. They should be visible on your filter on day 1. And depending on your build, you're probably going to want to equip at least one thing from this list, possibly multiple. Of course, if you're playing an SSF, you might not have the luxury of finding all of them. You might not have the luxury of finding the one you want. But in trade, if you need one specific piece, there's a decent chance you'll be able to purchase it fairly quickly, because these items are common enough that they tend to be very inexpensive after a short time. And if you have a few chaos and one of these looks really tempting, check on trade. And for a lot of these items, the rolls don't really matter all that much. But with that said, let's get into the list. If you enjoy this, maybe you want to see what I'm actually league starting, get subscribed, leave a like while you're down there. For now, let's get into things. Starting with number 1, the Kairi Ward. Strength and Dex is good for gems, both on an intelligence class that's lacking strength and dex, or on a dexterity class that's lacking strength. It has proj speed, proj damage, and movement speed. So if you're playing a projectile skill, this is going to feel really, really good. At low levels, having a little bit of proj speed greatly increases the immediacy of your damage. It causes the projectile to travel faster and also travel farther. Now on bow skills, this is especially good, because you can get increases and reductions to projectile speed is applied to damage, and that much damage very early on is going to make a noticeable difference. If you're lucky enough to find this in the axe, it can literally redefine your leveling experience as a bow build, which is something that a lot of the items on this list can't do. They'll certainly make it better, but they won't redefine it. Now, this of course does depend on how much you struggle with the early acts. For me personally, Act 1, Act 2, Act 3 are the worst, and by the time I'm getting to Act 7 or 8, then it's a breeze. Where the Kairi Ward really truly shines is in those Act 1, Act 2, Act 3 scenarios before any of your build comes online. So whenever I get one, I am super happy, and maybe you will be as well. Next up, Mark of Submission, a ring that was added in Delve League, and it provides Curse on Hit from day 1. Not only is it much more common than a lot of the alternatives, including Curse on Hit rings themselves, but being able to Curse on Hit is a huge quality of life boost. And the cool thing about Mark of Submission in particular is you can still level up your Curse gem for increased effect of that curse, because most curses scale as they level. So whereas a Curse on Hit ring gives you a level 1 version for baseline effect, it's still a really nice quality of life bump. Mark of Submission is in some ways even better. Of course, rings are a really good source of resistances. You often want life on a ring, and they're a great place to fix your attributes. Mark of Submission has none of those stats. You're giving up your entire ring just to Curse on Hit. For me personally, I value quality of life enough that this isn't even a question. If I get a Mark of Submission early, then I'm going to put it on. And if I don't, there's a pretty decent chance that I'm going to buy one until I can afford a proper Curse on Hit ring. But hey, maybe you don't value any of that and you really just need strength on your ring, in which case, give it a pass. Now the next one's a little niche. Not everyone's going to need it, not everyone's going to use it. But I suspect that this league, Poison's going to be pretty popular. And if you're not watching this at the start of Affliction, maybe Poison will be popular at your league start as well. That is the Dendrobate, which is kind of a chess piece for people who can't afford Covenant. But it also has a really nice, well-rounded allocation of stats. You've got All Res, which scales pretty high and makes getting res on the rest of your gear easy. You have Chance to Poison, which is pretty good because that way you don't need a 6-link version on day 1 to get most of the effects of a 6-link. And it also has Evasion and Energy Shield, which enables the Life Mastery for 15% life if your chest has no life mods. I'm pretty darn sure that none of the poison mods count as life mods, thankfully. Though you do have to be really careful of that stuff, there are some weird things that count as a life mod. And provided you're able to meet the dexterity and intelligence threshold, it does give quite a lot of damage for an undergeared or low-geared poison character. Now if you're not playing poison, unfortunately this one doesn't help very much, but until you can afford a Covenant, or until you can get a more defensive chest like a Lightning Coil, this is absolutely a great option that provides surprising amounts of value. Oh yeah, and it's super common, so after that, you can just corrupt it, and hey, if you hit something good, now you can 6-link it with Tainted Currency and have yourself a endgame viable chess piece. Not perfect, but really darn good. Next up, Prismweave, an item that you really want to find during the acts, but don't really want to use in maps. Prismweave is super good early because it adds a lot of damage, and it especially adds damage at a point where your build's very vulnerable in that regard. You don't have much on your weapon's probably not very good, and you need help scaling, so Prismweave is there to help. The reason that this doesn't end up going well later is once you get a weapon with, say, 1000 DPS, the little bit of extra flat added by Prismweave isn't worth giving up a belt slot, since its stats are quite poor in comparison to something like a Stygian Vise. You can get most of Prismweave's rolls just on the Abyssal Jewel in your socket of a Stygian. So it gets outscaled very hard later, but to start with, it's really not that bad at all. Then if you're playing caster stuff, Obliteration. This is one of my longtime favorite ones, because I love explosions, and maybe your skill doesn't quite deal with all the monsters in the best possible way. I mean, you can kill tanky rares, but everything else just gets away from you a little bit. Oh, don't worry, Obliteration will clean them up no problem. If you have a base Fizz skill, this wand provides surprisingly competitive amounts of damage. I remember playing a Wave of Conviction Ignite Elementalist a couple leagues back in Forbidden Sanctum, I believe, and I was using an Obliteration for a very long time. In fact, it was surprisingly competitive with my 20 Divine weapon. To be clear, the 20 Divine weapon did beat it by a good margin, but it wasn't like it was tripling my damage, and for a 1 Chaos Wand, I mean, that does some heavy lifting to even be remotely within the range of a 20 Divine Scepter. But every build scales a little differently, so it might not scale yours that hard. Either way, the pops are quite handy and can be used on, well, anyone pretty much. You don't have to be a Fizz build, though I would recommend this for Fizz builds where possible, so that you get the Fizz as extra. Next up, another nice defensive item, Immortal Flesh. This is a pretty well-rounded belt that gives a lot of life regeneration while taxing the other suffixes on your gear just a bit. In particular, if you're ailment immune, which you probably should be via Purity of Elements, then you also get increased armor, and that feels really good if you can get it at a low level. When builds like Righteous Fire or Bone Shatter are popular, Immortal Flesh is one of the most used items at League start. When those builds aren't popular, then it's less used, but still really darn good. I wouldn't necessarily go out of my way for this on a lot of builds, because losing the resistances is a little bit unfortunate if you don't absolutely need the regen, but it is a lot of regen, and having that feels really good, especially with the armor. So if you happen to get one, and you can fit it in, absolutely put it on. Oh, or if you're a Pathfinder that can just cap all their res with flasks fairly early on, yeah, do that as well. And I guess if you're playing around in Affliction League with Warden of a Magi and you have tinctures, you're capping out all your flasks and stuff, maybe this is a great choice that'll carry you all the way through your early mapping experience. Then we have another item that starts off really strong, but falls off later. Le Hoop of All. It provides attributes and damage, which fixes a lot of problems in your builds. For example, not having enough damage to kill enemies gets fixed by having more damage. Not having resistances and not having attributes can be big blockers. Those can get you killed, especially after you defeat Kitava. So if you happen to pick up a Le Hoop of All, then it'll definitely go a long way. Unfortunately, while it is a relatively common item in the grand scheme of things, it's also a lot rarer than most of the other items I've mentioned so far. This all being relative and of course subject to change because GGG does sometimes move around rarities of different unique items, so in the future it may be different. But in general, I wouldn't count on getting this one as a drop, though it could be an early purchase if you feel you need the value. That kind of depends on how quickly you're going to be leveling, and how quickly you're going to need to replace it. I obviously wouldn't buy an item for several chaos that I'm just going to replace in 20 minutes as I get to the next act. But if you think you're going to be using it for a couple days, then I would say it's absolutely worth the investment. And speaking of items that are worth it, this is the first item on the list that's fully best in slot endgame viable without a question. That is Cloak of Flame. This gives a massive amount of damage shifting. And what's really cool about Cloak of Flame's damage shifting, as opposed to a lot of other damage shifting, such as that provided by Lightning Coil, is it doesn't specify the word hit, meaning it even applies to bleeds. And you'd be surprised how much that helps, especially when you're doing lab. There are so many times where I've done lab with a Cloak of Flame on and I've gone, oh, the traps don't hurt, that's wonderful. It also gives fire res, and it has no life mod, so you can pick up a really nice life mastery. Cloak of Flame is a super awesome item. Personally, I'm very happy that it got reworked a while back, and hopefully I don't regret saying this because hopefully it's not unreworked or nerfed in a future update. I'll genuinely be sad to see it go, since I think it's part of why defenses in Path of Exile feel so good right now, and it's one of the only ways to mitigate damage over time effects from Fizz. So if you want to be a little bit extra tankier, definitely pick it up. You don't have to be an ES build. Coloring might be a little bit of a pain if you don't need blue sockets, but requirements are low enough that you don't really have to corrupt it and use tainted chromes. You can mostly roll what you want as long as you're not going for like RRR GGG. Yeah, if you're going for 6 off colors, maybe don't do this and stick with a lightning coil instead. It's slightly weaker, slightly harder to get, but still pretty darn obtainable and not all that different. Speaking of endgame viability, there's also Tanu AI, where provided you're able to fill your life and remove your leech, you get Onslaught and Adrenaline, or if at very least you have a chance to. But since you can always fill up and then take damage, fill up, take damage, fill up, take damage, you pretty much just get Onslaught and Adrenaline a lot of the time while you're mapping. Onslaught increases your attack and move speed, which feels really darn good. People used to make a second character to mule Onslaught specifically because of how good it felt. And Adrenaline also feels really, really, really good. That's why these are endgame viable, especially if you get them with a good corruption. Adrenaline gives damage, speed, and defenses. Now, neither of these buffs will be up 100% of the time. There is going to be a little bit of downside, and in that regard, the Death Rush ring is definitely a better option, but Death Rush is a lot rarer and more expensive, whereas Tanu AI are not only reasonably stat efficient for attack builds, but far, far easier to obtain. So if you're looking for something on a league start, go with Tanu AI, and if you really like the Adrenaline and you're not playing a champion, upgrade into a Death Rush later. Death Rush is the sort of item that while its stats aren't perfect, it can absolutely be someone's mapping best in slot. And finally, Singularity, a pretty good entry-level endgame weapon for a lot of spellcaster builds. Not only do you get a good amount of lightning damage to spells, you get pretty solid amount of cast speed. Reduced mana cost of skills means you might not have to go Eldritch Battery, or you might not have to life tap. Nearby enemies are hindered, and you can also get hinder on spell hit, and 100% increased damage with hits and ailments against hindered enemies. So this weapon kind of comes down to a very solid lightning damage to spells, 130% increased damage provided you're able to fairly easily inflict that hinder, and a little bit of cast speed. In most cases, I don't think Singularity quite rises to being someone's best in slot, but at league start, it's incredibly difficult to get something better, which makes it a very, very good item. And again, due to how common it is, they're going to be around, and you can pick them up on not only hit-based builds, but also ailment builds. So if you're somehow poisoning with lightning spells, a thing that you very much used to be able to do with Phantasmal Spark, and probably won't be doing so much anymore because Phantasmal Spark doesn't exist. Or maybe a better example would be Wave of Conviction Ignite. If you want an alternative to the Obliteration, pick up a Singularity. Or for something that wouldn't scale off of a Fizz as extra like Hexblast Ignite, then Singularity is a really good bet. And so those are the 10 unique items to look out for at league start. But there's so many uniques in Path of Exile, and so many uses for those uniques, that I'm now curious, if you're a more experienced player, or maybe you play one thing and know it really well, what uniques would you recommend to everyone else as part of their league start? Either something that should be on your filter because you're probably going to want to pick it up and equip it, or something that you might not find too often but is fairly easy to buy on trade. Put your suggestions and recommendations down below. And if you want to know more about Path of Exile, maybe you need a league start guide, head over to Maxwell GG. With that said, thanks for watching. A special thanks, of course, to my patrons and channel members for the continued support. For as low as $5 a month, you can see your name on screen, just like these fine folks here. If you're league starting today, then good luck. If you're doing a practice run, I hope it goes well. And if you just wanted to know what are some good unique items, well, I hope you learned something, and I'll see you again sometime soon.